Hello, class, and welcome to Applications of the Pythagorean Theorem. I'd like to give a shout out to my 8th period class. You guys rock. You have been fun, and you have been learning. All right, let's go ahead and get started. We're talking about the Pythagorean Theorem. The first thing I want to tell you is that the man who created this, his idea was that he found that the area of the square that's above or at the hypotenuse, this is the one you see highlighted, is equal to the sum of the area of the two squares that make up the legs. Now, in this problem, they give us the hypotenuse and they give us one of the legs. So to find this, we can rule out a couple of these. When you look at your choices, look at choices C and D. Those are not complete squares. Okay, so we're going to mark those two out. Okay. Now, to determine what our answer will be, we're going to take the area of the square from A to C and subtract the area of AB. All right, now let's go ahead and figure out the area of C squared. If you notice, it is a 5 by 5. So 5 times 5 is 25. If you count all those blocks, you're going to get 25 blocks. Okay. All right, now we're going to go to the next one, A squared. And if you count all of those blocks, we have a 4 by 4. So counting those, that will come up to 16 blocks. Our area on that one is 16. Okay, and that leaves us to find B. We know that it's going to be one of those squares. So we are going to do the math on the next one. When we go to solve this, we're going to subtract 16 from both sides. Your 16s cancel out, so we have B squared equals 9. Now, we want to know what that does tell us that the area is 9. And when you look at that on B, your choice B, you can count those blocks, and you do in fact have 9 squares make up the big square on B. On A, however, you have 14. Excuse me, not 14, 16. So the A is not a correct answer. B would be our answer. Now, if we were actually finding the length of B, we would take the square root of it, and it would simply be 3. The square root of 9 is 3. Okay, so B is our answer on that one. All right, number 2 it says, look at the diagram below of the Pythagorean theorem. What is the area of square A? The first thing I want you to do is write down that formula. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Now, we're going to start with C squared, which is your hypotenuse. Locate your hypotenuse. Remember, it is opposite the right angle, and it measures 289 square inches. Okay, that is the area. That is C squared. Okay, now we need to figure out what C is. Okay, we know C squared equals 289. To figure out C, we're going to go ahead and do it. Okay, all right, now let's go ahead and figure out, let's plug in B. The area of B squared is 64 square inches. and that leaves us with a squared. Okay, so here to go ahead and solve this, we're going to subtract 64 from both sides. So a squared equals 160, no, that's not right. 120, 225. You got it. Okay. So now we have a times a, or a squared, equals 225. That is, and that's what they're asking for. They're asking us for the area of that square A. So your answer is going to be 225 square inches. Okay, now let's go ahead and find out the side lengths of each side of this triangle. We're going to start with the hypotenuse. Your hypotenuse, remember, measured 289 square inches. If you were to take the square root of that, or some of you have in your journal that little help sheet that shows you what number squared gives you 289, and you will notice on that little help sheet that it is 17 squared. So 17 times 17 is in fact 289. Okay, let's go to B next. B should be fairly easy. This is one that you've done in the previous grades. The square root of 64. What times what gives you 64? And the answer to that is going to be 8. 8 times 8 is 64. So B measures 8. Okay, and on to letter A. A, our area was 225. What times what gives us 225? Okay, go ahead and look at your chart. And that you should get 15 on that. Okay, so side A measures 15. And that was a little bit more information than they actually asked for on the question, but I want you to remember how to find that. Now, we need to make sure that this makes sense. Remember that we said the hypotenuse is always the longest side. So if we look at it, A measures 15, B measures 8, and then C is 17. So it does in fact work. The legs are shorter than the hypotenuse. Okay, now we're going to take what we know about the Pythagorean Theorem and apply it to some word problems. Now, before we get started though, I have to give a shout out to my first period class because most of them watched their video and they are so awesome asking questions and learning. And first period, you're awesome. All right, let's look at number 3 here. We have Jane is having a rectangular patio constructed in her backyard. Well, we already know it says rectangular patio, so we know that the shape that we're going to be looking at is a rectangle. So how many feet long is the width of the patio? Well, let's look at our picture here. What do they give us? They give us the length of the patio, which is 16 feet. But they don't give us the width because if you go back and look at your question, that is what they're asking us to find. Your question is, how many feet long is the width? So we've got to figure that out. But instead of giving us the area of that rectangle, they've given us the diagonal of that rectangle, which is 20 feet. Now, if you highlight those 3 sides that we're dealing with, that makes a right triangle. And if you notice, that little red center she has there is where the right triangle is. If we look at this, remember our 2 legs are the A and the B in our formula. And we have A and our B. And then C is our hypotenuse, which is our longest side. So the first thing that we do know about the width, it's going to have to be smaller than 20 feet because our longest side is already 20 feet. So now B is 16, not B squared. So 16 squared would be our B squared. And A, we don't know. That's what we're looking for. So we're going to leave that as A squared when we're plugging it into our formula. And then C is 20. So when we put in our formula, we have to have 20 squared. Now, look in your journal and figure out what 16 squared is, because that's not something that you know off the top of your head. And so 16 times 16, or 16 squared, is 256. And then if you look in your journal and you look at your 20 squared should be in there as well, and that's 400. That one's easy. Now, I have to figure out the A squared here. So I'm going to subtract 256 from both sides. And I'll get 0, and I'll have A squared by itself on the left-hand side. And then when I do 400 minus 256, I get 144. Now, 144 is not the width of my patio. 144 is A squared. So now I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So if I take the square root of A squared, I get A. And if I take the square root of 144, I get 12. So my width of my patio should be 12 feet. Now let's make sure it makes sense. Is it smaller than 20 feet? Yes. So I know is 16 squared plus 12 squared is going to give me 20 squared, and that gives me the width of my rectangle. All right, let's look at number 4. Selena wants to cut a square piece of fabric in half along the diagonal. I want you to underline that word diagonal. And anytime you're going to have a diagonal of a square or a rectangle in a word problem, you are going to use the Pythagorean theorem. That is one of those clue words that should signal to you that we are going to use the Pythagorean theorem. And the diagonal is always my hypotenuse. And I remember that as diagonal is a long, complicated word to say, and hypotenuse is a long, complicated word to say. So both of those mean the same thing. All right, so what do we have here? We have a square. So I know one side of my square is 4 yards. But what do we know about squares? All the sides are the same. So I know that my other side of my square is also going to be 4 yards. Now that I have 2 sides of my triangle, I can put it into my formula. So I know A squared plus B squared equals C squared. So my A is 4, so 4 squared, plus my B is also 4, 4 squared, equals my C squared. So 4 squared is 16, and 4 squared is 16. So 16 plus 16 is going to be my C squared. So C squared, or 32, is that right? 32 equals C squared. Now that's not C, that is C squared. So our very last step we have to do is take the square root on both sides. But if you notice that square root of 32 is not a perfect square. So we're going to look in our journal and try to figure out what it's going to be, and we're going to just estimate what C is. So 32 would be between the square root of 36, which is a perfect square, and also the square root of 25. So the square root of 25 is 5, the square root of 36 is 6, so we know it's going to be between 5 and 6. So it's 32 seems to me is closer to 36 than it is to 25, so it's going to be on that last half. It's going to be bigger than 5.5. So I'm going to say it's 5.6, 5.7, or 5.8. You get to choose. But I would choose 5.6. So then I would say that C is
approximately 5.6. So let's look at our answer choices. I didn't even know we had answer choices. Look at that. We were just solving it all the way. So now that we have answer choices, that's easy because I know that it's going to be 5.7 because that is one of my estimates. Now, if you look at A could not be correct before you even started because we know the hypotenuse has to be the longest side, and 4 yards would not make it the longest side. So a lot of times they'll throw an answer in there for you that just doesn't even make sense, and you can eliminate that one before you even started the question. So 8 yards is too much, and 16 yards is just doing 4 squared, which that doesn't even make sense. So B is our correct answer. And let's go down here. We got one more. Joseph leans a ladder. Oh my gosh, leaning a ladder. That's in every word problem you see on every test that you have, and every time you see somebody leaning a ladder up against a building or a house, you know that you're going to use Pythagorean theorem every single time. So let's draw our ladder. So our ladder's leaning, and if you remember, ladder is leaning, so guess what? That's the hypotenuse every time because your building is not going to be leaning, it's going to be straight. So our one leg is going to be the building, and then the other leg is just going to be the distance from the building to the ladder. So the ladder is 12 feet away from the building. So that means that that has to be 12 feet from the building. Then, and the ladder itself is 15 feet. So I know I have the hypotenuse and one of the legs. So now I can fill it into my equation, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared, or my formula. So let's just say that 12 feet is my A. So we're going to say 12 feet is A, so 12 squared plus b squared, because I don't know what b is, and then 15 squared is my C. So let's figure this out. 12 squared is 144, and 15 squared is going to be 225. So to get the b squared by itself, I'm going to subtract 144 from both sides. And I get 0 on that side, and then I have b squared all by itself equals 81. Now that's b squared, that's not b, so to find that side or how tall the building is, I'm going to have to take the square root of both sides. So the square root of b squared is b, and the square root of 81 is 9. So the building would be 9 feet, or the ladder would be touching the building at 9 feet high. So remember those clue words: ladders, leaning ladders, diagonals. When you see those words in your word problems, you know you're going to use the Pythagorean theorem. All right, peace out. See y'all later.